Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another special gathering. Before we begin, I want to know who's here with me tonight. Leave a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is for you. All right, let's get to the first story. Good evening, Dom. My name is Eduardo. I grew up in a quiet little town where the old paved roads were worn down and most of the houses were small and simple, separated by chain-link fences or half-finished walls. My mother, Ms. Silmara, used to tell me from a young age that if I ever got married, I should evaluate not just the person but the entire family. She said, "You never marry alone." I thought she was exaggerating until I lived through what I'm about to share. I was about 22 when I decided to try my luck in a bigger city, hoping to find a job. I've always been interested in manual labor and leather craftsmanship, so I ended up working at a small leather bag factory. This place was located in a cramped neighborhood full of old buildings, auto repair shops, and small food stands set up along the sidewalks. My mother, who stayed behind in our hometown, would call me from time to time to check if I was all right. I shared a room with two other guys in a basic boarding house, but at least I managed to send some money to her every month. It was in that little factory that I met Carolina, a young woman who had just been hired as a sewing assistant. She had a bright smile, was tall, had warm brown skin, and a gaze that seemed to welcome everyone. In a short time, I noticed she stood out among the employees. Some offered her rides in their cars, others invited her to lunch. I always went to work and came back on crowded buses. I didn't have much and couldn't afford restaurants. One day, however, I worked up the courage to invite her to grab a snack at a food stand near the factory after our shift. "Would you mind a simple place?" I asked, feeling a bit embarrassed. She flashed a wide smile. "Of course not. I love these stands. It's been a while since I've had a good hot dog." I wasn't sure if I was more nervous about her reaction or the possibility that the food stand might close before we arrived. In the end, it all worked out. We talked a lot, and she seemed more interested in who I was than in what I could provide financially. I became suspicious of her down-to-earth attitude, wondering if it was some kind of test or charm. But as time passed, Carolina showed me she genuinely enjoyed our simple outings. A hot dog, a soda, and if we had spare change, we'd share some fries. A few months later, we started dating. At first, I thought it wouldn't last because she seemed to have good opportunities, and my paycheck barely covered my share of the room and food. But Carolina, always smiling, said money wasn't everything. She worked as well and had no problem splitting expenses. Meanwhile, I was afraid of losing the woman I loved to someone with better means. So in a fit of insecurity, I asked her to marry me. I had no savings, couldn't afford a big wedding. Still, she said yes, with the same bright smile that had dazzled me from day one. We said we wanted something simple at City Hall. We didn't even dress up in fancy clothes. She explained that her mother, Ms. Veronica, lived alone in an old house on the outskirts of town with a spacious backyard that would be perfect for a small reception. She suggested that after the civil ceremony, we stay at her mother's place for a while, until we could get on our feet. I confess that the thought crossed my mind. Am I biting off more than I can chew? But I accepted. After all, if her mom was as kind as she was, everything would be easier. On the day I went to meet Ms. Veronica, I immediately noticed her displeased expression. She had gray hair tied back in a floral scarf and wore an apron stained with flour. As soon as she saw me, she gave me a look as if I were an intruder. Carolina tried to smooth things over. "Mom, this is Eduardo, the one I told you about. We're getting our marriage papers signed at City Hall, but we'd like to know if we can use the backyard for a small celebration." Ms. Veronica didn't even let her finish. She waved her hand impatiently, frowning. "Celebrate what if you two don't have a dime?" she retorted, shaking her head. I tried to stay calm. I remembered my mother's warning. "You marry the whole family." I felt a chill, but swallowed hard and introduced myself. Nice to meet you, Miss Veronica. I know we don't have much, but Carolina and I just want something small. She looked me up and down, making no effort to hide her disdain, and spoke in a curt tone. Huh, and do you think you can support my daughter on that paycheck of yours? Before Carolina could intervene, I tried to explain that she also worked at the factory, that we would help each other and, in time, save enough for our own place. Ms. Veronica rolled her eyes but allowed us to use the yard for a small reception, as long as it wouldn't be too much trouble for her. The way she emphasized those words made me uneasy. As we left, Carolina squeezed my hand. Sorry, honey, Mom's suspicious of strangers, but you'll see things will get better. Even so, a wave of cold anxiety washed over me, echoing my mom's voice. Evaluate the family carefully, son. I took a deep breath and pressed on. I believed in Carolina's love. The civil ceremony was tiny. Just a few of our co-workers from the factory, some of her relatives, a couple of my cousins, and that was it. We signed the papers, took a few photos, and by afternoon, we were at Ms. Veronica's house. She had placed some plastic chairs in the backyard, and Carolina had ordered a simple cake from the local bakery. There were no big speeches or music. Maybe because of that, I assumed it would be less stressful. But Ms. Veronica took every chance to jab at me. For each guest she greeted, she made sure to point out that the cake was simple because the groom couldn't afford anything nicer. Or she would blurt comments that made me blush, like, "My daughter deserved something way better, but what can you do, right?" As soon as people began to leave, she approached me with that stern look. "If you two don't want to pay rent in the city, you can stay in the back room, but if you cause any trouble, you're out." My pride wanted to refuse, but Carolina hugged me. "Let's take this opportunity, Eduardo. We'll save up and leave here soon." I nodded, embarrassed. Then Ms. Veronica vanished inside the house. I took one last sip of lukewarm soda, trying not to show my distress. Carolina kissed my cheek, seeming grateful. I thought, it's only for a while. We settled into that back room. It had an old double bed, a warped wardrobe, and a small window overlooking the backyard, where Ms. Veronica kept several potted plants. At first, despite my mother-in-law's unpleasant remarks, married life seemed promising. I worked the morning shift at the factory and often did overtime in the afternoon. Carolina managed a few sewing gigs outside her shift, so we gradually saved a little money. Every couple of weeks, we gave part of our earnings to her mother as a contribution for staying there. She'd take the cash with a stony face, never thanking us, but she didn't complain, until the day we announced that for about a month, we'd need to save nearly all our paychecks to rent a place of our own. "So you're going to cut my share?" Ms. Veronica asked, arms crossed. "Not cut," Carolina tried to clarify gently. "Just reduce it so we can move out of here soon." My mother-in-law glared at me as though it were all my fault. From then on, her comments grew relentlessly malicious. She insinuated I couldn't even support my wife, that I was just a tenant. Although Carolina saw how frustrated I was, she seldom confronted her mother directly. It was like she was afraid to stand up to her. One Sunday morning, when I hoped to find a bit of peace, Ms. Veronica decided to cook lunch for an elderly uncle who was coming to visit. She left several notes ordering me and Carolina to help set the table and tidy up the backyard. While I was wiping down some chairs, I caught a strange sour smell coming from the kitchen. I peeked inside and saw my mother-in-law stirring a pot of meat with a dark sauce. There was also a dish of rice and vegetables on the stove, but it didn't look like the same broth that was boiling in the larger pot. I swallowed hard, unsure if I was just imagining things. When we finally served the meal, Ms. Veronica placed plates in front of her uncle and her daughter, then brought one for me. It was from that big pot, and it smelled even stronger. I glanced at Carolina's plate, thinking she would be eating the same thing. It wasn't the same. Her sauce was lighter in color. Noticing my discomfort, she asked softly, "You okay?" "This smell seems a bit off," I murmured, not wanting to accuse anyone. "Don't complain, boy," my mother-in-law cut in, taking her seat. "You ought to be grateful there's food at all." To avoid a scene, I tasted a bite. It was bitter and kind of sour. A wave of nausea hit me, but I held it in. Her uncle and Carolina seemed to eat something different, milder. I said nothing else, forced down what I could, then pushed the plate away. Even worse was the pleased expression on Ms. Veronica's face, as if she were enjoying the spectacle. After lunch, I hurried to the bathroom, feeling my stomach turn, but I couldn't throw anything up. That same night, I started feeling chills and a pounding headache. I thought it was just food poisoning, but the pain soon turned into severe abdominal cramps, fever, and a debilitating weakness that kept me in bed. I spent the night tossing and turning in the sheets, sweating cold. The next day, I couldn't go to the factory. Carolina was worried, but Ms. Veronica just tossed a towel onto the edge of the bed. "It's probably just an overreaction or a weak stomach." Over the week, my symptoms worsened. Besides the stomach pain, my hands began to tremble. I lost the strength to hold tools. My knees ached, and I felt pins and needles in my joints. I tried making an appointment at the local clinic, but they only had a slot 2 weeks out. I had to stay out of work, which meant a smaller paycheck. Carolina was left to support the household almost alone. Naturally, my mother-in-law didn't cut me any slack. "See, Carolina? What kind of man can't handle even a strong cold?" Even in my weakened state, I heard her remarks echoing through the house. She made a point of walking by our room to mutter how useless I was. Carolina tried to smooth things over, but she never openly stood up to her mother. When I realized I wasn't getting any better, I suggested, "Sweetheart, maybe I should stay at my mom's place for a while to recover. I don't want to drag you down. And since your mother treats me so badly..." Carolina shrugged like she didn't want to disagree, but was somewhat relieved. "I think that's a good idea. You can rest, and maybe by the time you come back, you'll be better." It felt like a temporary goodbye, but it hurt anyway. On Saturday morning, Carolina left to visit an aunt and wouldn't return until Monday. I took a bus, struggling all the way to my mother's home. She was shocked to see how skinny and frail I looked. "Son, what happened?" She helped me put away my bag and settle into my old bedroom. I gave her a quick explanation, saying it all started after Ms. Veronica's suspicious meal. My mom looked at me gravely. "I don't like to say this, but I believe something was done to you. Some people don't know any limits. I'll call Ms. Tanya, a faith healer in the neighborhood. Maybe she can help, at least until your clinic appointment." I agreed. After all, I had nothing to lose. Ms. Tanya arrived that same afternoon. She was an older woman who spoke in a low voice and carried a worn rosary in her hands. She asked for a glass of water, said a few prayers, and then brushed a sprig of herbs over my body, murmuring words I didn't understand. Each time she passed the herbs over my chest, I felt a mild tingling sensation. It might have been crazy, but in my state, I wasn't dismissing anything. "He's definitely got something attached to him," she said, looking at my mom. "Looks like a work of envy or hatred. If it's not witchcraft, it could be some natural poison. I'll try to cleanse him." She smeared oil mixed with leaves, praying under her breath. I admit the smell turned my stomach, but I endured it. In the end, she said, "It won't go away overnight. He'll need more sessions and some herbal teas to cleanse his body." My mother agreed to buy whatever was needed. Meanwhile, I didn't hear a word from Carolina. I assumed she was overloaded with responsibilities, but by the third day, Mum came back from the market furious. A neighbor told me she saw Carolina in town with another man. I didn't want to believe it, but she swore it was her, holding his hand, looking pretty cozy. My heart sank. Despite everything, I refused to believe it. Still, the news wasn't entirely surprising. Living under her mother's roof was a nightmare that could have pushed her into a more comfortable situation. I felt more anger than heartbreak. It looked like my marriage was over before it had truly begun. My health kept fluctuating. Sometimes the pain was so bad I couldn't stand. Other times I managed to walk by bracing against the wall. I had to sign the divorce papers from a distance, lacking the strength to fight it. Carolina never showed up to give me an explanation. Later I learned from one of my cousins that she really had gotten involved with a better-off guy. I felt a tightness in my chest, but I followed Ms. Tanya's instructions, drinking bitter teas and attending weekly prayer sessions to ease my symptoms. Over time, my pains lessened, although my hand still trembled. Doctors couldn't pinpoint a cause. It seemed like poisoning, but no test confirmed the agent. Medical treatments offered little help, so I held on to the faith healer's guidance and my mother's patience. Little by little, I improved enough to get a new job at a small sewing workshop near my mum's place. The pay was modest, but enough to support myself and help with her household expenses. Around that time, I heard rumors that Carolina was abandoned by the man as soon as she got pregnant, and that Miss Veronica fell gravely ill. I felt neither happiness nor pity, just emptiness. Everyone reaps what they sow. A few years passed. I still dealt with occasional tremors and joint pain, but I managed to work normally again. Ms. Tanya told me the damage from that curse or poison would never fully disappear. Sometimes I had nightmares about Ms. Veronica cooking something in her pots and glaring at me with a wicked grin. I'd wake up drenched in sweat. My mother always reminded me, "Don't hold on to resentment, son. Hatred can also make you sick." I tried to follow her advice, but sometimes the anger flared up when I recalled the humiliation. To move forward, I started going out on weekends, chatting with friends, and living beyond that toxic memory. Eventually, I heard that Carolina had another child from yet another complicated relationship. I barely reacted. It only confirmed she was on a difficult path. One day I bumped into an old co-worker from the factory, Gustavo, who told me Ms. Veronica had died about a year before. She developed a degenerative disease and spent her final months bedridden, bitter as ever. Carolina was struggling, looking for work. Gustavo shot me a curious look. "So, Eduardo, do you ever think about looking her up? You were married after all." I shook my head. I had no reason to look for her. I remembered all too well those nights of agony, the poison or spell that left me half disabled. I went home with Gustavo's words echoing in my mind, but I decided it was best to keep my distance. More than 6 months passed. My routine remained quiet. I woke up early, went to the sewing workshop, came home at dusk, and helped my mother with her small garden. Then, one afternoon, as I was closing up the workshop, a woman approached me. Her hair was tied back with a scarf, her eyes were sunken, and she wore an anxious expression. It took me a moment to recognize her. Carolina. She was thinner, with dark circles under her eyes. She held a small boy by the hand, maybe 5 years old. I froze. "Sorry to show up like this," she said, her voice trembling. "I need to talk." A heavy silence followed. I didn't know what to say, so I took her to a nearby diner. I didn't feel comfortable bringing her straight to my mother's house. We sat down, and the boy looked around as Carolina began speaking, voice shaky. "I'm unemployed, Eduardo. I heard this place has a sewing workshop and someone told me you work here. I need a job. Anything." I nodded, not sure if I felt betrayed, angry, or pitying. "I'll see what I can do. The boss sometimes hires people for general tasks. But—" "Your mother?" I asked, not intending to be cruel. She lowered her gaze. "My mom died some time ago. She had horrible pains. No medication eased them. She left me in debt. The house almost collapsed after a roof leak. I lost pretty much everything." I sighed. As much as I remembered how that family had hurt me, I'm not one to gloat over someone's misfortune. The boy was watching me curiously, so I handed him a little bag of cookies I'd bought at the diner. He gave me a shy smile. "What's his name?" I asked. Gabriel, Carolina said, from my last relationship, which also fell apart. We sat there in uneasy silence for a while, and then I promised to talk to my boss. Once we were back on the street, she thanked me with tears in her eyes. I know I've lost the right to ask you for anything after all that happened, but thank you. Seeing her like that stirred conflicting emotions. Part of me remembered the bright smile she had when we first started dating, the woman who happily ate street snacks with me. Another part recalled how she abandoned me when I needed her most. I simply nodded and went on my way. At home, I said nothing to my mother at first. I planned to discuss it with the workshop owner the next day. My boss agreed to interview her. To my surprise, he hired Carolina for cleaning duties. The workshop needed someone to sweep the floor, wash greasy parts, and handle the break room. She did well in her first days, showing efficiency and organization. I tried to avoid her, but the workshop wasn't big, so we saw each other often. Gabriel played in the reception area whenever she had no sitter. One afternoon, she approached me while I was sorting some fabric rolls. "Eduardo, I wanted to say thank you again. I only got this job because of you." "I just talked to the boss. You're the one working hard to keep it," I answered, keeping my tone professional. She stared at the ground. "I know I don't deserve your compassion after what I did, but I can't leave without apologizing, especially for that meal my mother served you. There's something I never told you." I stayed quiet, a rush of bitter memories surfacing. "I saw my mum tossing strange powders into the pot," Carolina continued. "When I asked her what it was, she said it was to keep the son-in-law around. I thought it was some silly superstition. But I guess it made you sick, didn't it?" My heart lurched. So that was it. Poison or weird herbs, something worse. The confirmation hit me like a punch to the gut. "I did everything I could to get rid of it," I said in a low voice. "You left me alone at my worst." She lowered her head even more, her eyes filling with tears. "My mother manipulated me, and I let her. I was afraid of struggling with no money, with debts. When I had the chance to be with someone financially stable, I thought it would solve my life." "Did it solve anything?" I asked, barely sarcastic. "Number he left me when I got pregnant." She looked away, red-eyed. We both went silent, broken only by the hum of sewing machines in the background. Then she stepped back and disappeared down the hall, leaving me with a conflicted mix of pity and anger. I spent the rest of the day trying to focus on my work. That night I had another nightmare about Ms. Veronica stirring her dark pot. Yet strangely, when I woke up, my body hurt a bit less. It felt like speaking the truth had released something inside me. Over the following weeks, I got used to Carolina being at the workshop. She didn't force any closeness, but helped me out whenever I needed an extra hand. Gradually, we managed small talk. Gabriel grew fond of me, occasionally running over with a cheerful smile as if I were a fun uncle. One night, she called me in a panic. Gabriel had a fever and she had no money for a private clinic. She asked if I could lend her some or suggest a public hospital. My mum, overhearing, said, "Son, never refuse to help when a child's in trouble. Take them to the emergency room." So I did. We spent hours in a modest hospital waiting for treatment. During that time, she opened up about the hardships of raising a child alone, paying overdue rent, and trying to hold on to her job. I felt some of my bitterness dissolve, remembering how I had also wished for someone by my side when I was sick. After several delays, Gabriel was seen, medicated, and cleared to go. Carolina looked at me with genuine gratitude. "Thank you, really." I swallowed hard and just nodded. At least the boy was okay. In the months that followed, the workshop routine became more pleasant. My boss eventually promoted Carolina to a better position, overseeing the inventory and cleaning sewing materials. I tried not to mix personal feelings with work, but inevitably we grew closer. One afternoon, she invited me to have lunch at a small diner nearby. I ordered a bowl of stew, and she just had a basic plate of rice and beans. While we ate, she asked, "Do you still feel pain?" "Less than before, but my hands still shake if I'm nervous or if it's really cold." She nodded thoughtfully. "I found a spiritual healer here in town and they say she's good. Should we go together?" It was like she wanted to finally drive away the harm her mother had caused. I agreed, unsure if it would help. A few days later, we visited a modest little house on the outskirts. Ms. Sebastiana, the woman who greeted us, prayed with candles and used strongly scented herbs on us, insisting there was a negative link lingering in our connection. It reminded me of what Ms. Tanya did in my hometown, but Carolina seemed relieved after the session. In the weeks that followed, my tremors eased even more. As time passed, I learned that the old house where Carolina had lived with Ms. Veronica had partially collapsed after a heavy rain. She ended up selling the property at a low price, leaving her with debts and bad memories. She confessed she had recurring nightmares about her mother, haunted by guilt over Veronica's lonely death. I said nothing. Deep down, I had my own nightmares, visions of that suspicious pot, and the feeling I was drowning in a dark stew. Despite it all, Carolina and I gradually drew closer. We started sharing light-hearted moments at the workshop, and sometimes spent weekends making sure Gabriel had what he needed. When my mother realized we were seeing each other again, she grew concerned. "Be careful, son. You've already suffered so much. Don't make the same mistake." "I understand, Mom, but the circumstances have changed. Ms. Veronica isn't here anymore, and Carolina seems different now." She sighed. "I just don't want to see you hurt again." I agreed, though I was scared myself. The truth was that despite the wounds, there was still a spark of affection between me and Carolina. Maybe the memory of those happier days, before her mother's interference, had never died completely. One evening after work, Carolina invited me over for coffee in the small room she rented. Gabriel was staying with a neighbor. I went in and noticed the place was simple, with few pieces of furniture but neatly kept. She poured freshly brewed coffee and offered me a slice of cornbread. "I know it's strange to have you here like this, but I really wanted to thank you," she said with a shy smile. Looking at that slice of bread, I couldn't help recalling the last time I'd accepted food from her mother. A chill ran through me. She noticed and lowered her gaze. "Sorry, if you don't want to eat, I understand." I took a deep breath. This was a different situation, and the recipe was straightforward. No strange smells. I cut a piece and took a bite. It tasted like normal cornbread. She gave me a tearful smile. We ended up talking for hours, reminiscing about the past. She even cried, asking my forgiveness again. I wasn't sure if I was ready to say I forgave her, but at least in that moment, there was no poison between us, just the heaviness of a messy history. About a year later, as we became accustomed to each other's presence, we started a more serious relationship. We didn't know if we should call it dating or trying again, but I slowly began spending nights at her place. Gabriel, who already referred to me with an affectionate nickname, started seeing me as a sort of father figure. Over time, we formed a modest family, even if unofficial. My mother stayed watchful at first, but she could tell I was happier. During that period, the physical after effects almost disappeared. I still had days of knee pain or shaky hands, but it was more manageable. Doctors never gave me a definitive diagnosis. By then, I didn't dwell on it. Perhaps, as Ms. Tanya once said, when we let go of resentment, the evil loses its hold. Carolina was now focused on her job and taking good care of Gabriel. She didn't talk about other men from her past. She seemed determined to rebuild her life. We had tense moments when we argued, usually about Ms. Veronica, but we quickly moved forward. Carolina confided she had visited her mother's grave, leaving flowers and asking forgiveness for her anger. Even so, she understood that if her mum had harmed us, she also paid a steep price in the end. She felt no joy, just acceptance that cruelty has consequences. Today, life is calmer. I'm still at the same sewing workshop and sometimes do repair work on the side. Carolina was promoted again and is recognized for her dedication. Gabriel is in school, growing fast. We haven't remarried legally, maybe because we prefer to take it slow after all that happened. The agony I endured, the poison that made me wither, has mostly faded into an internal scar. On cold days, I still feel sharp pains in my back, reminding me of that nightmare. But I don't nurture anger or seek vengeance. Only a strange nostalgia for the time when Carolina and I were young and hoped for a wedding free of obstacles. Sometimes I visit my mother in my old town and have coffee with Ms. Tanya, who always asks if I'm healthy in both body and spirit. I tell her I'm at peace, and she smiles, saying nothing is stronger than the will to carry on. So I move forward, carrying one vital lesson: never underestimate the influence of the family surrounding your loved one. Because as Ms. Silmara taught me, you don't just marry one person, you marry their entire circle. Maybe if Ms. Veronica had chosen a different path, none of this would have happened. Or maybe Carolina and I would never have formed such a strong bond. There's no way to know. What I do know is that witchcraft or poison aren't mere superstitions when they stem from someone's real malice. Sometimes they leave marks that even science can't fully explain, but forgiveness, even partial, even belated, can heal wounds that once felt everlasting. Before we move on to the next story, if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell to get the latest stories. Your presence means a lot, and your support is essential. All right, let's keep going. I have always hesitated to share what I lived through, mostly out of fear that no one would believe me, or worse still, that they would think my mind had lost its way after so many trials. Yet I feel that staying silent only makes the past torment me more. I'm going to tell what happened in my own way, hoping people will understand that not everything is black and white, and that there are things capable of shaking even the firmest convictions. I grew up in a simple house in a rural region alongside my Aunt Lucy, my only remaining relative after my parents died in a fire. I was only 5 at the time, and although I remember few details, I still get flashes of flames and desperate voices. I never asked much about it. Aunt Lucy was a reserved woman. Whenever I brought it up, she would just nod slightly and tear up. So I let it go. The house where I spent most of my childhood was in a very isolated part of the countryside. No need to name specific towns or locations. Just know that we got there by a dusty dirt road, winding through low hills and dried-out vegetation most of the year. Around us there were barbed wire fences marking the farmland, with a few heads of cattle scattered about. Farther on, you might see a handful of small shacks belonging to other residents of the area. Aunt Lucy was a strong woman, her face weathered by the sun, and she always had a watchful expression. Even as she approached 60, she carried herself with a certain unyielding poise. The way she walked made it clear she was in charge of the house. For a long time I thought it was overkill, but now I understand that her firmness was the backbone that kept me standing. The place we lived in had 2 rooms with roughly plastered walls, a dining area that merged into the kitchen, and a backyard filled with vegetables, herbs, and roaming chickens. Despite its simplicity, I was quite attached to that house. The roof shingles were old, and on rainy days, I loved hearing the dripping that formed puddles in the yard. At night, however, the darkness seemed heavier there than anywhere else I've known. When I was little, Aunt Lucy had a list of habits that to me bordered on the absurd. Never leave the broom with its handle upside down after sunset. Don't whistle after 11 at night. Don't hammer nails on a local saint's feast day, and don't stare into the mirror in the dark. I found all of it overly superstitious. I wondered if these were quirks passed down by her own mother, or if she made them up to scare me. As I grew older, I realized her rigidity wasn't just discipline, it was also a method to keep certain things at bay. Sometimes she would sprinkle coarse salt under my bed and say, without looking me in the eye, that it helped ward off bad influences. Or if we had visitors, she would place a sprig of rue on the doorstep. I felt silly taking it seriously, but over time, I accepted it as part of our routine. I used to attend a simple school in the nearest small town, which took me almost an hour to walk to. There were about 20 classmates, and many teased me about the smoky smell clinging to my clothes. Thanks to our wood-burning stove at home, I was embarrassed, but instead of arguing, I pretended not to hear. When I came back, I'd often find Aunt Lucy praying, sometimes to Catholic saints, sometimes murmuring words I didn't recognize. She would always stop when she saw me enter and would say only one thing. "You got home early, Isabella." She never explained those odd prayers or the herbs hanging in the kitchen. At 13, I rebelled against all of it, yelling that those superstitions made no sense in today's world. She never argued. She simply said, "One day you'll understand why I do this." Then she would turn her back. I hated that resigned tone, as if telling me I was still an ignorant child. It was around this time that John started showing up. He was the son of a distant cousin of mine and lived in a bigger city. He spent vacations with us because, according to his parents, he needed to breathe fresh air and learn to get by in the country. So every year there was John wearing his flat-brimmed cap, phone in hand with no internet signal, complaining about boredom. He was 2 years younger than me, but never stopped teasing our beliefs. One time, Aunt Lucy caught him messing around with some ribbon charms she hung on the gate. He was laughing and saying, "If that creature really existed, it would have grabbed me already, right?" She just stared at him and asked him to put the ribbons back. John rolled his eyes but obeyed. I still remember Aunt Lucy's serious look, as if she was momentarily pondering something unsettling that might be lurking. That same year, when I turned 15, my aunt started talking more often about a place she called our family's old lands. She said the property, quite a few miles away, had been practically abandoned since my grandfather's death. According to her, there were unresolved matters that haunted her in the form of recurring nightmares. I didn't see how something could be so important as to disturb her sleep, but I noticed she avoided giving details. She mostly stayed quiet, gripping an old worn rosary. My dad, when he was alive, used to say we had deep roots in that plot of land, but after the fire, everything was lost. Years later, I decided to bring up the topic with Aunt Lucy. "Why don't we just sell that land once and for all?" She looked at me with a sad expression. "We don't sell what's stained, Isabella. The land isn't at fault, but it remembers, and everything that was done there still weighs." That sounded cryptic to me, but I wasn't interested enough to insist. I kept on with my studies and helped around the house. Then came a certain religious holiday, I'd rather not say which one, when Aunt Lucy announced she really did need to return to that old property. She wanted to check on the grounds because she'd heard from some folks that strange noises, footsteps, and voices had been reported near the ruins. She mentioned it would be a quick visit, but invited me to come along, saying that I, as an heir, needed to see it with my own eyes. I didn't want to go. I knew it was far and that there was barely a path leading up to it. But John, who had just arrived to spend a few days, thought the idea of exploring the haunted old lands was pretty cool. He loved filming with his phone to post later, and figured he might get some interesting footage if he found anything weird. It annoyed me, but it also piqued my curiosity. So I decided to go. We set out on a Thursday afternoon. Aunt Lucy thought it best to avoid traveling the dirt road at night, so we drove to a certain point and then continued on foot with light backpacks. The walk was tiring. The sun was scorching and a thin layer of dust rose with every step. On either side we saw dry brush, fallen fences, and the occasional abandoned house. John was snapping photos of everything like a clueless tourist. Aunt Lucy was silent, eyes fixed on the horizon with concern. When we finally spotted the old property, I saw nothing but a ruined shack, its roof caved in and walls cracked. There was a collapsed corral with no intact fences standing. The wind blew through, causing the loose boards to creak like a lament. I didn't remember ever being there before, even though it was supposedly our family inheritance. Maybe I was too young when everything fell apart. The place felt hollow, like it had been the stage for something that drained all life around it. We entered through the front door, which had toppled off its hinges. Inside, I recognized the remains of furniture covered in dust and cobwebs, broken window glass, a completely rusted wood-burning stove, and what looked like an improvised altar in the corner of the living room, with melted candles and a shattered statue of a saint. John thought it was creepy and recorded it, laughing. "If there's a ghost here, it must be bored to death with all this mess," he quipped. Aunt Lucy told him to show respect. He shrugged. The afternoon slipped by as we explored the few rooms. In one of them, there was a collapsed wardrobe, revealing moldy photographs on the floor. I found a picture of someone who looked like my grandfather, very young, next to a woman I didn't recognize. The photo was stained with mildew, but you could see a certain seriousness in his expression. I showed it to Aunt Lucy. She took it gently, sighed, and tucked it into her pocket. By sundown, we lit a few kerosene lamps Aunt Lucy had brought. The wind outside grew thicker and colder. We decided to sleep in what remained of one bedroom, spreading out some camping mats. John joked that it was the best accommodation on earth, but I could tell he was uneasy. Staying in the middle of nowhere without cell signal or distractions wasn't as funny as he'd expected. Aunt Lucy warned us not to leave the house in the dead of night. She spoke in a tone that allowed no debate. "There's an old weight here. Don't go into the brush when the moon is high." John rolled his eyes. "What if I need the bathroom?" She only repeated firmly, "Hold it till morning." We ate the sandwiches we'd packed and drank bottled water. The wind whistled through the cracks, and sometimes I thought I heard footsteps outside, but maybe it was just the wood creaking. I could explain it all without resorting to ghost stories. Still, I stayed on guard. Aunt Lucy prayed quietly, a rosary in her hands. John tried to distract himself with a game on his phone, but with no signal, no battery, and barely any light, he gave up. We turned in before 10. I struggled to fall asleep. It seemed the silence made every sound louder. Around midnight, I heard noises outside, like dry leaves being crushed underfoot. I wondered if it might be some animal, but then I remembered Aunt Lucy's warning not to go out, so I stayed put, ignoring the urge to investigate. John was snoring in the other corner, which comforted me a bit, meaning he wasn't about to stir up trouble. In the early hours, something woke me. Sitting up on my mat, I looked around and noticed my aunt was gone. The lamp was almost out, leaving just a faint glow. A pang of fear struck me. I stood slowly, careful not to trip on the junk scattered around. The house felt even more claustrophobic in the dark. I made my way to the living room, calling to her in a low voice. "Aunt Lucy?" No response. The wind picked up outside and the door creaked. I was sure I saw a shadow glide past the doorway. My heart skipped, but I steadied my breathing and kept going. Near where the altar used to be, I found my aunt on her knees, whispering something I couldn't make out. She was staring at a wall where a faded image of a saint remained, its face scratched. "Aunt," I repeated. She turned slowly, as if coming back from another world. She looked at me with teary eyes. Approaching, she grabbed my arm. "Isabella, stay inside. Promise me you won't leave," she said, voice trembling. I nodded. She let go of my arm and wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Then she helped me return to the bedroom. I stayed there, trying to fall asleep again while she continued praying in a lower voice. By early morning, John told me he had also awakened in the night, but chose not to move. The next day, Aunt Lucy said she needed to settle something by herself out in the yard, where the old corral had been. I wanted to go with her, but she asked John and me just to gather our belongings, since we'd be leaving that afternoon. I agreed, not fully understanding. While we collected our stuff, we heard odd murmurs from where she was. John started toward her, but I stopped him, reminding him she told us not to interfere. As the hours dragged on, she eventually came back looking pale, as if she'd dredged up painful memories. I asked if everything was okay, but her answer was vague. I did what I had to. Let's go. We grabbed our gear and took one last look at the ruined house. Before leaving, I had a strange feeling, like something was watching me from behind a loose board. I didn't see any shape, but a chill ran down my spine and I quickened my pace. John noticed my nerves and laughed, but it was a half laugh, offering no real reassurance. We began the trek back to the main road as the sun sank fast. Aunt Lucy urged us to keep up a swift pace. We probably walked 2 hours straight. Night was nearly upon us when I realized John had slowed down, glancing back frequently as though expecting someone. I asked him, "What is it?" "Nothing, it sounded like hooves on the ground," he murmured. I rolled my eyes, annoyed. Probably a stray cow. But his expression wasn't playful. I kept walking, pretending not to care. Sometime later, we reached the spot where we'd left the car. Relief washed over me since it was already quite dark. We quickly loaded everything, but when Aunt Lucy tried to start the engine, it wouldn't turn over. John popped the hood, though he didn't really know what he was looking for. Aunt Lucy sighed, visibly worn out. "Take it easy," I said. "We'll keep trying." After a few attempts, the car finally started and we headed out. John, in the back seat, was silent. The mood in the car was heavy, almost stifling. We drove along the dirt road, the headlights catching only dust and brush. At one point, the engine sputtered and the lights flickered, plunging us into darkness for a moment. When they came back on, I swear I saw something dart across the road ahead. No clue what it was. Maybe an animal. My heart pounded. "Did you see that, Aunt?" I asked. She didn't answer, just pressed the gas. John turned pale but kept quiet. The dirt track finally merged into a wider road, and we continued until we reached home late at night. I climbed out and nearly sighed with relief. Aunt Lucy said nothing, just grabbed her keys and walked in. John took a quick shower and threw himself on a mattress in the living room, not wanting to talk. I was lost in thought, remembering the scared look in his eyes. My aunt locked all the windows and lit a candle near the little shrine in the kitchen. The following weeks were strange. John left sooner than planned, claiming he had things to do back in the city. He wasn't the same cocky boy anymore. He was anxious, biting his nails, and he barely cracked a joke. He left one morning with a hasty hug, and I didn't hear from him for a while. Aunt Lucy, on the other hand, kept up her prayers and even spread more herbs than usual around the house. Still, I began hearing noises in the middle of the night. Footsteps in the yard, shapes passing by the window, just silhouettes. The most disturbing thing was a strange smell, like something burnt mixed with sulfur, appearing out of nowhere and then disappearing. I tried rational explanations, but my instincts told me there was an unpleasant presence lurking. One night I woke to a crash in the kitchen. I rushed over and found Aunt Lucy breathing heavily, gripping a knife that gleamed in the lamp's light. She looked at me, pale, and said only, "Don't open the back door for anything in this world." I nodded, confused. I spent the rest of the night leaning against my bedroom doorway, heart pounding. If there truly was some evil entity, I couldn't define it. Maybe it was just my fear-fueled imagination, or maybe a flesh-and-blood intruder. But the chickens weren't squawking, there were no barking dogs, and that somehow made it creepier. From then on, everything got more tense. On several occasions, I found footprints abruptly ending at the back of the house, as if the person had leapt and vanished. Aunt Lucy started making me drink a bit of rue tea before bed. She also insisted on keeping a glowing ember in the wood-burning stove all night, saying the smoke kept the wrong ones away. Sometimes the pungent smell choked me. About 2 months after our trip to those old lands, John showed up again, unannounced. When I saw him at the door, I noticed he looked thinner, with dark circles under his eyes. He hugged me and whispered, "I need to talk." We sat on the porch in the sweltering afternoon. He told me he'd been having constant nightmares. He dreamed of walking a dark trail, hearing the clip-clop of horses' hooves that were never visible. Sometimes he woke drenched in sweat, smelling smoke and rot. And one night he thought he glimpsed the silhouette of a huge animal standing by his bedroom door. He had become obsessed with the memory of our trip to the old lands. Something had attached to him when he mocked the charms and Aunt Lucy's warnings. He broke down, admitting he was terrified he was losing his mind. I suggested he stay with us for a few days, see if it helped. Aunt Lucy listened to his story and didn't seem surprised. She simply prepared a smudge mixture and blessed him with old prayers, muttering something more like chants I couldn't understand. John submitted without a word, not even a half smile. On his first night back, we were awakened by noises in the living room. I ran, expecting to find him in the midst of a nightmare, but instead I saw John standing there, shirtless, staring at the door leading to the backyard. He was trembling. I picked up the lamp and shone it on his face. His eyes were wide, drenched in sweat. "Are you okay?" I asked, my own voice shaking. He answered in a whisper, "Something is calling me out there." I moved the lamp closer to the glass in the door. All I could see was the darkness of the yard and twisted trees. I was about to say it was just his imagination, but stopped when I caught that same burned sulfur smell. John reached for the door latch, but I grabbed his hand. A moment later, Aunt Lucy appeared, stepping between us and the door. She flung a handful of coarse salt outside and muttered, "If something's circling you, it won't get in tonight." Through the crack, a cold wind blew in and snuffed out the lamp. In the dark, I heard John choke, as though seized by terror. Aunt Lucy clutched my arm and whispered, "Isabella, help me, hold him." I held John, who seemed half in a trance. He was shaking, trying to repeat someone's name, but not quite forming the word. I felt him shiver like he had a fever. Only after we dragged him back to the couch, chanting prayers, did he stop struggling. He sat there, head bowed. The night crept on in tense silence. From that point on, the three of us got very little sleep. By day, Aunt Lucy sent me out to gather more herbs, or to visit a local woman who sold blessed pouches and protective charms. John lay in a hammock, staring off, barely speaking. By late afternoon, he confessed that this entity, or whatever it was, invaded his dreams, leaving him gasping for breath when he woke. He said he felt guilty for mocking everything, and that he was paying the price for his disbelief. I had no answers. I only felt the tension building in our home. That same week, worn out, Aunt Lucy pulled me aside and told me what weighed on her. She said that our grandfather, while still young, had dabbled in practices that veered from standard faith. He made promises in exchange for better harvests, sacrificed animals in dark rituals, and bonded with something she referred to as the shadow. Aunt Lucy was there, saw her father lose his mind, and spent her life trying to escape that legacy. But after the fire that killed my parents, she sensed that shadow was creeping back around the family. The abandoned place apparently acted like a magnet. She went back there hoping to close it off. She wouldn't say exactly what she did, but clearly it wasn't enough. Something still slipped through, and John, by ridiculing it, became a sort of target. "I can't fully explain it," Aunt Lucy said, her voice shaking, "but I won't let this continue. I'm going to perform a final protection." She told John and me to stay in the house that evening and meet her in the kitchen, where she'd set up a protection ritual. It wouldn't be miraculous, just a mix of prayers, smudging, and Catholic supplications, plus the folk knowledge her mother had taught her. I agreed, exhausted by fear. John agreed too, desperate for any relief. On the appointed night, we locked everything. Aunt Lucy spread a white cloth on the table, placed a bowl of water, and lit candles in each corner. She dropped some potent oil into the water and scattered herbs around. She repeated short phrases. "No one who bears darkness may pass here." She asked John to kneel at the table and press his forehead against the cloth. He did. I stood beside her. Then she began praying aloud, words that combined Bible verses with calls for protection against evil. As she did this, a wind swept through the kitchen, stirring the candle flames. I felt as though the ceiling might crack. Aunt Lucy told me to repeat every word with her, so there I was, reciting pleas I'd never heard before. In the midst of that ritual, John gasped and groaned as if he were in pain. His body trembled. I put my hand on his shoulder to steady him. Aunt Lucy tossed a handful of coarse salt into the water and touched his forehead as though marking some invisible sign. That's when I heard a thump against the back door. I raised my head, alarmed, but didn't leave John's side. One of the candle flames went out on its own. That same smell of smoke and sulfur invaded my nostrils. I swallowed hard. "Don't go, Isabella," Aunt Lucy warned, noticing I had shifted toward the door. She moved closer, sprinkling water around until a small wet circle formed on the kitchen's cement floor. She kept praying, louder and louder. I thought I could hear scratching sounds outside on the wood. I closed my eyes, resisting the urge to run. The prayer went on for several long minutes, and with each verse, the burning smell seemed to retreat, until finally it was gone. John began to calm down, breathing more steadily. When Aunt Lucy finished, silence settled over us. We opened the windows and let the cool night air in. My heart was still pounding, but I sensed nothing strange anymore. John, still on his knees, started to weep in relief. I helped him stand. Aunt Lucy exhaled, exhausted, explaining that we had sealed up the gap through which the evil was peeking. She didn't sound triumphant, just matter of fact, like someone who did what had to be done. We spent the rest of the night talking and drinking tea to soothe our nerves. None of us slept much, but by some miracle, no eerie noises bothered us until dawn. Over the next few days, John slept better. His dark circles began to fade, and he regained some of his humor. I also stopped hearing footsteps in the yard or catching whiffs of sulfur. It seemed that, at last, the presence had receded. Aunt Lucy, though, never fully relaxed. Sometimes I caught her sitting in the backyard, gazing at the dirt road leading to the old lands. She seemed to sense it wasn't truly over. John went back to the city, taking with him a little piece of cloth covered in embroidered prayers that Aunt Lucy gave him to keep under his pillow. He hugged me before leaving and told me that if the nightmares returned, he'd come running back for help. I smiled, but deep down I worried that might happen. Months went by and life settled to a degree. Nights were quieter, and our routine returned to normal. Then Aunt Lucy's health started failing. She developed a persistent cough and tired easily after any activity. She insisted she was fine, blaming age, but I noticed she was fighting pains she didn't want to admit to. I began helping out more, collecting firewood, tending the chickens, cooking. Still, the coughing never ceased. One afternoon I got an urgent message at work. A neighbor who'd dropped by with some flour found my aunt collapsed in the kitchen. I rushed home to find her weak but conscious. I took her to the local clinic in town where she was examined. The nurse said it looked serious, possibly long-term lung damage from breathing in wood smoke. She needed continuous care that was hard to get in that area. Aunt Lucy was shaken but refused to leave our house for more advanced treatment. She claimed she felt bound to that place and intended to finish what she started there. I didn't understand, but I respected her wishes. I did what I could with home remedies and tried to make her comfortable. She spent most of her time in bed, her face pale. Sometimes I heard her praying softly between coughs, asking forgiveness for something I never fully grasped. One night, with no stars in the sky, Aunt Lucy called me to her room, held my hand and spoke in a near whisper. "I'm not afraid to die. I only regret I couldn't seal all the doors. If you ever sense that smell or that cold again, Promise me you'll pray and never mock it. Don't try to fight it with disdain." Tears poured down my cheeks. I told her yes, I'd do everything she taught me. She looked at me like she was saying goodbye, then murmured, "You're strong, Isabella, stronger than you think." Later that night, her breathing grew faint and stopped. I clung to her body, unable to believe it. I spent the rest of the night weeping, remembering every sacrifice she'd made for me. The funeral was simple, with few in attendance. Many people were wary of Aunt Lucy's oddities. I approached the local priest, who did a brief blessing. I buried her in the town cemetery, in a modest grave. After everything, I was alone in the house, unsure of my next steps. I was 17, newly so, and felt orphaned a second time. In the months that followed, I clung to her memory. I continued sleeping in the bed I'd always known, praying with the rosary that had been hers. I got occasional visitors, but mostly people left me alone. Sometimes, though, I felt a chill when I walked through the house, especially in the spots where Aunt Lucy used to light her candles. I tried not to feed my fear, recalling her words, that scorn and mockery opened doors. I kept my faith sincere without going overboard. I said small prayers before sleeping, left a sprig of rosemary in the kitchen to ward off bad things, and maintained the little rituals she'd observed. Slowly, I began gathering my belongings to leave that place. A friend from school got me a job at a clothing store in the center of a nearby county. I wanted to resume my studies and maybe build a more stable life. When I finally decided to move out, I felt a pang. I walked through every room, taking in objects soaked with memories. Then I locked everything as best I could and left the key with a trustworthy neighbor in case they needed to go inside for some reason. Before stepping through the gate, I glanced back at the yard where Aunt Lucy taught me to plant and respect the land. I whispered a final goodbye, praying she was at peace. Then I headed down the road, carrying a suitcase and facing an unknown world ahead. I felt nervous, but also free, as though I had experienced more than someone my age should. I had no clue where John might be. Maybe one day he would show up again looking for answers or reassurance. Every now and then, even today, I still dream about the ruins of those old lands. I wake with my heart racing, but if there is some haunting there, it doesn't frighten me like before. I've learned that there are energies and forces beyond our knowledge, and it's not our place to sneer at them, but to respect them. Aunt Lucy did all she could to protect us. I have faith that was enough for us to go on. I've never smelled sulfur since. Maybe our cursed inheritance has finally quieted down, or maybe it's waiting for another chance if someone dares to provoke it. All I can say is that I won't open that door again. I carry in my heart the experience of someone who learned firsthand how the unknown can shake us. And if darkness ever tries to circle me again, I'll remember Aunt Lucy's prayers and the strength she instilled in me. That's how I move forward, without arrogance, but with enough courage not to be bowed by fear. Hey everyone, thanks for listening. Click the notification bell to stay updated on all future narrations. I post new videos here every day. I hope to see you in the next one. On the screen now, I'm leaving 2 other great videos I know you'll enjoy. See you there.